Marylene Delbourg-Delphis, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Bora.
Welcome to Maker's Wave. So, Marylene, I have notes, you're one of the first European women to have founded a tech company in Silicon Valley. You have a PhD in philosophy. You're an entrepreneur with a PhD in philosophy. You've helped over 30 companies as a shadow CEO or board member. You've been awarded the French Legion of Honor, the highest order of merit for military and civic accomplishment. So I had to read up on that and learn about that a little bit. If you could just give us a little bit of your story here.
Well, you said it all. I mean, you did a summary. So that's true. I used to teach. I started in life teaching philosophy, not very long though. And I ended up needing a database for my research on the history of perfumes. I couldn't find one, so I created a company that would enable me to have a relational database. And it ended up being the first relational database, graphical relational database on Macintosh. So I started a company in France, and I mean, I'm trying to make it short, right? And very soon after that, I started a company here in Silicon Valley, and I was lucky enough to have as my co-founder Guy Kawasaki. So this is how I stopped teaching philosophy. I stopped writing books on the history of fashion and perfume, and basically went into business. And I learned a lot along the way, of course, because this was not my background. But everybody can learn. That's the secret of happiness, in a way. And after that, I stayed in the US and I was the CEO of other companies. The important thing, and you mentioned that I've helped a lot of entrepreneurs, and I continue to do that, is that while I was running my own companies, I always wanted to help other entrepreneurs, because it was a way for me to understand my own problems as a CEO. Um, and that's the first aspect of it. And the second aspect of it was um, I wanted to make sure that I wouldn't have a tunnel vision. Because when you run a company, you think that the rest of the world doesn't exist. So for me, helping other entrepreneurs, and often women, was a way to keep in touch with the reality. So I always recommend to, even when we are very busy as CEOs, we have to make sure that we talk to other CEOs, we help other CEOs all the time, because as CEOs we have problems every day, and we don't want to acknowledge those problems because we feel bad. We say, well, we shouldn't have them. Okay, we try to kind of hide those problems. When we talk with other CEOs, we notice that they do have the same problem as ours, and we're forced to admit we have them. So that's, sorry, is it a detour?
No, it's not a detour at all. So, you're also the author of this new book that we have behind me, Beyond Eureka. I just finished it, and I took a lot of notes inside. And right before our call, I was going through all of the pages that I marked, and I was writing them down. Um, but before I get into that, what made you write the book?
um I think I explained it a little bit. This is the topic of innovation, has been basically my life. I mean, most of us entrepreneurs, we want to innovate one way or the other. Okay? We want to do something that puts a dent in the universe, to use Steve Jobs' phrase. Not necessarily in a big way, but in some ways. And so this has been my life, trying to do things that people had not really done before or thought of before. And this is the life of so many tech entrepreneurs, especially tech entrepreneurs for me. Um, so one day I decided to just address what innovation was. Mostly after talking with a lot of entrepreneurs, were asking me all sorts of questions. So that's why the book is not kind of big dissertation about innovation. It's organized into chapters. Okay. Um, what is the difference between an inventor and an innovator? Do we need to be disruptive? How is it that there can be competing product at the same time, uh, almost in the same place? What is it to be in the good? What is it to have a good timing, etc.? How is it that women have such limited impact on the innovation space? So basically, I these are questions I had myself as an entrepreneur that I have all the time when I help entrepreneurs, and these are all related to innovation. So instead of doing a big speech on innovation in general, I wanted to kind of analyze it from the point of view of specific questions.
Hmm.
Does it-
Well, I really enjoy the book. I read a lot of books. I read like 100 books a year, and all
Wow,
business books.
congratulations.
And I really enjoyed reading this one because I actually wrote down some of the things. You can tell that a philosopher wrote it. It's not just an entrepreneur, not just a tech person, but a person who thinks deeply about humanities. Well, let's start with the first interesting thing that caught my attention, which I'd never heard of before, and that's the concept of kairos. Is it how you say kairos?
Yes, you can say Kairos,
Or,
yes.
how do you say it normally? It's a Greek word
Well, I mean,
originally,
this
I
is a
guess.
Greek word, so you say
Yeah.
Kairos,
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 Kairos. Okay,
whatever.
yeah.
I'm
So
very impressed that you noticed that. I'm really, really impressed.
the Kairos,
Yes.
I looked at, I'm like, what is this thing? Because it's almost like it's a moment. I'll let you describe it. It's a combination of few things that come together to make turn into innovation Kairos, and that's a really important thing to understand. What is it?
Yeah. So thank you so much. I'm very impressed that you focus on this. So I needed a word to reflect the fact that when we start something, we don't live in a world that is homogeneous. Okay. Our world is composed of multiple layers. Okay. That's one thing. And each of these layers have their own tempo. So we live in a very composite world. So when we start, what layer do we address? To whom do we speak? So I took the example of the Macintosh, for example. Um, Steve Jobs addressed mostly artists, intellectuals in the 80s. Great. But there were other people, and they really, he struck a chord with these people. But when you speak of people of their empowerment, of their dreams of being independent and having power, you touch you touch vibes that are slow moving. So you have you rest on ideological layers that do not compel people to buy. Okay, whereas Bill Gates with the doing the operating system for the IBM PC was like modeling his business on the fast moving pace of what's happening in companies. You buy a product every year, you have a budget for this, and so forth. So when we create, we have to decide the kind of layer we want to address. When we address the dreams of people, we are not sure to have people right away. We may have them 10 days down the road. Okay. So at the same time, you address several parts of the mental landscape of people, the mental universe of people. So that's what I mean by innovation kairos. Does it make sense to you?
It does. I think it needs to sit with us for some time to kind of fully comprehend it. It's one of those very interesting things, but I'm glad that I learned about it because it's multidimensional. It's not so
Ye-
simple.
yes. And
Yeah.
that's why we don't know if we are going to succeed. If we hit the right layer, that's going to propel us forward.
Hmm.
Sometimes we have
Yeah.
a great idea, but because we see something that is going to grow. Is it going to grow fast enough? Okay. So sometimes it's better to kind of move a little bit and catch a different wave, a different trend.
Hmm.
And
So in the book, the example of Eastman Kodak spans across multiple chapters. So normally when you think about Eastman Kodak, you because it's 2024, as you also mentioned in the book, maybe people don't realize how innovative they had been back in the day. Now it might seem like out of touch or, but at the time, for a long time, they've been doing very interesting things. So in every chapter, you kind of tie it in. So I guess we're just going to touch it little by little in the questions that I have. One of them is you're kind of talking about Davids and Goliaths, right? So Davids and Goliaths are always a topic with every startup. Anytime you start something, VCs would ask you, well, why wouldn't Google do this, or why wouldn't Facebook do this, or something like that, right? So there's always a Goliath. So as a David, you have to have a clear answer. But I feel like that part of it is almost a little bit more played out. But you have a observation here related to Eastman. At the time, they didn't really have Goliaths, but differentiating from all the Davids wasn't a piece of cake either.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
that to me resonated because I feel like that's what's happening in this very moment with AI making it so easy to start anything new. It's become extremely noisy. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about many Davids and how do you
Yeah.
deal with that?
And the reality is that when you look at the history of innovation, it's you have the Goliaths, of course, but in every single domain, you have hundreds and now thousands and tens of thousands of Davids. And this was true. This has been true since the beginning of industrial revolution. You know, you have a few names that survive the first textile industrial revolution in England in the early 19th century, but there were lots of people trying their luck, lots of them. And with the increase, I mean, with the demographic increase, there have been more and more people. The number of people who are dabbling with um, electricity in 1900, there were like hundreds of them. Okay, this has always been true, and so for every single domain, when there is a good idea, you think as David that you have the best idea on the planet, right? But it's likely that there will be so many others who have the same ideas because it's really in the atmosphere. Okay, and so the way people one David succeeds against other Davids, and sometimes many Davids succeed, okay, is you have to know what everybody else is doing. You have to make sure that you're not late. You're including all the features,
Or
but
not
at
too
the same
early,
time, what?
or not too early either.
Okay, or not too early either. But you have to make sure that you include everything that people expect. But you have to also to make sure that your product remains usable. Because what threatens all the David is to what was called in the 90s the featureitis. Like you add features and features and features, and then the product doesn't add up anymore. So where you where Davids survive is first if they have money enough to fight, okay, to continue to fight, and second, if they are smart enough to determine what to add, not to add. But true, it's and we see this in AI today. There are hundreds and hundreds of fabulous products, and maybe two or three only are going to survive. The important thing, however, is that it basically builds up the whole space of where this field is going. Okay, and the sad part sometimes is there will be a Goliath who is going to assemble all the pieces created by all the Davids, and so sometime there is a real late mover advantage, and very often the late mover advantage goes to the Goliath because they had been able to observe, they have been able to sort out what was going to be able to carry on, and they have the processes, to make it happen, and they have the money. So the iPhone is the genius of Steve Jobs, but he was able to aggregate all the geniuses who made all the features of the PDA. And so Steve Jobs assembled all of this and even more, found the overarching architecture to make the iPhone. And this is a very frequent phenomenon. Do I respond to your question?
Yeah, yeah.
And this has been
So
true throughout history, by the way.
so interesting. One of the things about your book that kind of opened my eye is to understand a little bit more about history, because sometimes when it comes to technology, looking at historical companies doesn't feel so exciting, because in the back of
Exactly.
your mind you're thinking that's old stuff, it's a lot different now. But human psychology never changes, it's
No,
always the same.
and
So
you're
yeah.
right. You're completely right. Sorry to interrupt. You're completely right. And history shows us patterns, and patterns are no different today.
Mhm. So one thing you mentioned when you were describing, you said that there are hundreds of fabulous products. You didn't say just hundreds of products, you said hundreds of fabulous products. So I feel this is a very astute observation. Compared to 10 years ago, people know now how to build fabulous products. It's become, benchmarks have design. Maybe 10 years ago, I remember with my first startup in the early days, early 2010s, we could stand out with good design. Now you can't anymore, because everybody knows how to do good design. People learned it. So that brings me also, like, kind of really hard to do deep tech. So when it comes to building a startup or a company with pretty good technology, or really even really good technology, it's hard. So in innovating with technology and product has become hard, in my view, in my experience. So I'm quite intrigued by business model innovations, right? So in your book, you mention it. So in one part, again with Eastman, right? So you mentioned that Eastman won the paper battle through all sorts of business schemes, like exclusive deals with retailers or licensing patents to their arch enemies for price fixing. That one part that I really like, where you talk about innovative stroke of genius, and I read that part multiple times. Here you talk about focusing on picture taking and the pleasure people get from taking the photos and then looking at them, that makes the price of the camera feel like nothing. Now, this leads to recurring revenues because of the rolls of pictures, right?
Mm,
So, this seems to be an innovative stroke of genius. I'd love to
I
hear your
completely
view.
agree. And actually, I'm very impressed. You really read very carefully. Um, what we see when we look at the history of big innovators is they don't necessarily make the one thing that nobody else would do. They take a different perspective on the thing. And usually it's because they are very attentive to the outside world, to what I call the innovation kairos. Okay?
Mhm.
Instead of the taking the picture was the goal in the beginning. Okay. And the genius of Eastman was to think of the people looking at the picture instead of simply taking them. And this shift in perspective, this attention to the environment, is usually what distinguishes great people with great ideas and people who are real innovators. It's not. We speak of the interface. True, there are rules, but it's sensitive, being sensitive to the environment, to the mindset of people.
Mhm.
And this was the power of Eastman for sure,
Um,
and Steve Jobs. You know,
yeah, one part of your book was a little bit heartbreaking for me to read as an entrepreneur, but this is the reality. So this is the multi-layer maze in our customers' minds. So a little bit of what Eastman was able to achieve, because they went through the multi-layer maze, they hit them in the heart. The feeling that they feel made the price of the product feel like nothing.
Yeah.
So, as innovators, we hope our eureka moment will translate into a wow moment for customers, right? So,
Mm.
you hope that this happens. I hope that
Yes.
this happens with the stuff that I'm
Yes.
building. But that's not necessarily what happens, right?
No.
That's what you said. So, what happens?
Then what happens is that people live their life and live on their planet. Okay. So when we create product, we segment our market and we think of all the people who should buy the product. And in fact, we are right. But they don't have the same timing and agenda as we do. And so an example I take, you can probably afford to buy an iPhone each time there is a new iPhone. Do you do it? No. Okay. Because, well, I bought this one 2 years ago. It's still very good. Why not? And you think of all the pieces that makes the iPhone and the waste. You think of who actually the workers who created the iPhone and whatnot. Okay. And you say, well, I can wait. But then you have your buddy, surfing buddy, who have the latest iPhone. Then, oh, I should buy one because it's a status symbol. So when we create a product, we see all the reasons why people should buy it, when in reality we should have a pre-mortem thinking of all the reasons why it's going to be a delayed buy, because this is the way we buy ourselves. So we have to think that we are also customers. So as producer of innovation, we want everybody to have this big like wow moment, and we have to be realistic. And so we have to really plan for the situation where people are going to wait until they are ready to buy. And what is going to determine them to buy is something out of our purview most of the time.
Mhm.
And it's true, it's a little depressing. Um, so that's why it's useful to have more money than less money. And that's why also it can be hard to bootstrap. And that's why we have to be very lean when we run a company if we don't have too much money, because we cannot hope that people would around think of things the way we do. Okay, when there are features of products that we believe should happen, but people have been living without them for a long time. So why would they change the habit all of a sudden, even when they acknowledge that they need the feature?
Mhm. Yeah. Well, you touched on two topics that I wanted to talk to you about anyway. So let's move on to one of them, the concept of a pre-mortem. So, as an entrepreneur, you need to do a landscape assessment before you evaluate your idea. So, what do you think is the best way for founders to ask the right questions? So, like one thing that I've learned from experience is when you think you're doing research or asking the questions, it's very easy to do the wrong research and ask the wrong questions. And then you just like kind of affirm the belief that you already had and you keep pushing forward. And then, after some many years of experience, I've come to realize what type of questions to ask is actually a form of art almost. So that how you think about pre-mortem?
Yes, a pre-mortem is actually a way to demolish our own bias.
Mhm.
That's really when we create something and we ask the opinion of others, we present the thing so that they will say, oh, this is great.
Mhm.
Because we hate when people tell us, well, why would I buy it? You can invert the whole proposition and go to your friends and give me all the reason why you wouldn't give a damn to my product. Other people are embarrassed.
Mhm.
They say, well, please, this is what I need to know. all the reason why you're not going to buy into what I'm trying to do. And this is a very painful experience. So that's why people don't do it.
Hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
Well, yeah.
and in fact, when the company is somewhat larger, you create the company is going and so forth, and things are doing okay. And many entrepreneurs are afraid to look at the records of customer support, where you have all the flows analyzed, but everybody is afraid of something that goes badly. And so you can have a new release that doesn't even take into account the fact that you have dozens of unhappy customers. So it's um it's a heavy. I mean, it's part of the way to do a pre-mortem for the very first version and then the iteration and so forth is sometimes for the entrepreneur to pick up the phone and listen to customers' opinion and to be a tech support.
Hmm.
Okay. And then you really know what's going on and especially what's not going so well. Because the minute the company is about 20 people, you don't know what's, most of the time, you don't know what's wrong.
Hmm.
And being investigating what's wrong is very, very important task. Does it
Yeah.
make sense?
Yeah. I mean, this is all very interesting to me because I live it, right? So,
Okay.
just looking at my earlier years as an entrepreneur, forget about premortem because it's so hard to come up with ideas anyway. When you come up with an idea,
Y-
the bias that you mentioned, you're constantly looking for ways how it can succeed, but never
Yes.
want to think of the ways how it can fail,
Yes,
right? Then
exactly.
years go by, then you
Yes.
try this idea that fails, that idea that fails, this idea that fails, that idea that fails, and you become hardened and more realistic. You start thinking more like a VC. How could this fail, right? So now actually I have a few trusted founder friends that we do monthlies, um, to have a safe space to talk to each other about new ideas, and then we present to each other and say, how do you think this can fail? What would,
Yes.
like, we don't ask each other, do you like this idea,
Yeah.
but poke holes in it. How
Yeah.
could this fail? Tell me, be honest.
Yeah.
We have to be honest with each other.
Yeah.
So I find the pre-mortem idea very important, life-saving. I think super
It
important.
is life saving. You're completely
Yeah.
right. It is life saving, but it's also requires a lot of being humble because it's hard. I mean, it means that we have to be enthusiastic when we have a great idea, and so we want to defend it. We are fighters because it's the principle of being entrepreneurs. We are fighters. We are just ready to kind of change everything, right? Um, and at the same time, we must have something at the back of our minds. That, okay, why do I miss? What do I miss? Why is it going to be a disaster?
Hmm.
Um, and finding the right balance is sometimes very challenging. That's completely true. And this is where you need real sounding boards, not so much the VCs, because you don't want to explain all of this to your the people who finance your company. You need to have real coaches, real friends, and who are going to tell you things the way they are. Yes.
So the other thing you touched on it was bootstrapping, and I wanted to ask you about your views on bootstrapping versus taking VC money, because this is a very popular LinkedIn topic where people like to. Actually, I never see anybody defending VC money. All I see is how people should be bootstrapping. But I've been a VC funded entrepreneur, so I stay quiet. But what are your thoughts on this?
If you can bootstrap, I think it's a good thing, especially in the beginning, because it allows you to test all sorts of variation of your product. Um, but if you feel that there's something is picking up, sometimes you need to have more resources. And so um, you go to people who can understand what you're doing. Okay. The reality is that the companies that are funded by VCs is a minority, right? The best funding is always the funding of your customers. But sometimes you need VC money. So I mean, I don't have I don't have a strong opinion pro or against VC money. If you know what you're doing, and if you're comfortable having somebody who does not get into your business very deeply, because VCs are not necessarily very deep into the business, they are deep into the money that the business can generate. Um, Go ahead with VCs. I mean, it's sometimes it's a very good solution. So I'm not saying to people bootstrap for the sake of bootstrapping. Sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it doesn't make sense. It depends on the business, really.
Well, let's move from entrepreneurship back into innovation because, as you mentioned in your book, these are not the same things. You
Yes.
can be an entrepreneur. You could have an entrepreneurial startup that is not necessarily innovative,
Hmm.
but what we want is innovation. So I'm going back into it. So one
Yes.
concept that I like is the concept of across. So
The concept of
across, like across industries, across buyers,
okay, okay,
across
across. Okay.
complementary products. And I think this is important
Yes.
because I study creativity, ideas, interesting, world changing ideas that actually get wow out of the customers. How artists and the great artists come up with their own amazing ideas and artworks. And what you see is combination of ideas across different places coming together and
Yes.
making something new and unique.
Yes.
Like you mentioned, the turning the ideas upside down with the
Yes.
Saab's engineer in the book. Well, tell us a little bit more about across.
It starts, I mean, so there is, when we think in terms of analogy. We use images all the time. And so when we are creative, we're not in one space. We kind of implicitly, unconsciously, live in several places, spaces, several timeline. And given my definition of a kairos as a multi-layer world with multiple temporality, I mean multiple tempi, um, we always think across. So instead of looking at one thing, say, well, what what would happen if I transported this thing over there? And so this is across is the I would say the trigger to think differently, to place things under a different light. A very good book on this is Blue Ocean Strategy. I mention it, and I recommend people read it. And what I do is I generalize the concept of thinking across um, divides, across preconceived ideas. And when you have two ideas, how do you put them together? How do you manage them together? So you said it yourself. I mean, I'm not saying it better than you do. Across is the way to become creative. And I'm
Um,
glad you like this passage.
there's a lot more. So again, your philosopher comes out rustling of the breeze. So if innovative opportunities do not come with a tempest, but with the rustling of the breeze,
Yes.
are most people left with smaller innovations? Another
Yeah.
heartbreaking part in the book, but there's reality in it, so I want to
Yeah.
hear you talk
So the
about that.
rustling of the breeze is not coming from me. It's an expression that was created by Drucker. Okay.
Okay, yeah, all
Okay.
right.
And I put it in quotes, as you could say. Um, when we start, we want to do the big thing. We hope to think big. In reality, we have to start somewhere, and we do have to start smaller.
Mhm.
This is even Jeff Bezos would say it, right? Um, And people who say, well, I'm going to change the world overnight, are usually people who don't do anything. Um, so, we start with a dream of grandeur, and we have most of the time to be very happy with doing something that just people like and may not create a big company. But at the same time, we are part of the innovation, what I call the innovation stack. Okay, we contribute to to creating the building blocks on which other people will thrive. And so we realize that we are part of a community of creators. And so, in a way, it can be depressing because we want to be big. In reality, what we do is always much smaller than we think. Um, but at the same time, we should value more what we actually do.
Mhm.
And so, what I'm saying is that there are many, many, many more trailblazers than is usually spoken about in the business literature. The business literature is full of these kind of big iconic figures, and very few people are going to be those iconic figures. It's very intimidating. My perspective is actually more encouraging. So even if what you do is not that big, you can make a real difference.
Mhm.
So there are many more trailblazers than usually thought.
Yeah.
And so don't try to be an iconic figure for the sake of it. You can be a trailblazer. Does it make
Um,
sense?
yes, yes, and yeah, back with incredible uh, quotes that I found. For some reason, everything that I found seems to be the heartbreaking part. But maybe that's what I liked about the book, because there's just so much romance about entrepreneurship out there that lure you in, do your own thing, and then the reality is a roller coaster that really throws you around quite a lot.
Yeah.
Many people don't understand this. And another concept here is the concept of grinder. So innovation carols. I was going to ask you to open the page of the book and read you, but this is like, to me, this is entrepreneurship art. Innovation carols operates like a grinder that only spares the pieces that serve its durability more than our predictions. So read this 10 times, like everybody who's an entrepreneur. So imagine we have predictions, they won't be durable. A lot of them will go into this meat grinder. Some will stay out, and they will. So innovation carousel operates like this. And then, as entrepreneurs, we have to admit to ourselves our original mission, because we write down missions. We write down missions, vision, and then that mission ends up being a moving goalpost.
Yes.
Uh, our criteria for success changes, and then, and this is the last part I like. We embark on a treasure hunt, which there is no certain positive outcome,
Mm.
right? So I'll leave it to you. So like I find this part very interesting. It just opens your eyes of the
Mm.
realities of what really happens.
I mean, it's very realistic. Um, at the same time, when you're depressed because things are not going the way you want, you can tell yourself, "Oh, I'm not the only one." Okay, because many of the books kind of depict a landscape where you have an idea and everything goes fine and great and so forth, when in reality, what makes us creative is to go through all sort of upheavals. Okay, um, we have to adjust to the unexpected, the uncertainty all the time. And we want to start big, we end up small, but we have done something. So that's really the fate of wanting to innovate. And we have to be realistic about it. And of course, it's not as grandiose, as grand and romantic as, you wake up, you were born and you were destined to become Steve Jobs. No. Look at the the upheaval in Steve Jobs' life. Okay, um, so it's reassuring to think that we are part of a general process in the civilization. With what we do still matters.
Mhm. Um, One of my favorite chapters that really relevant to how I think about things is the standing out chapter. So how to stand out, right? So there's some truth in here. To be noticed, we need the right product
Yes.
for the right market. That's two.
Yeah.
With the right business model.
Yes.
Three. The right competitive positioning.
Yes.
Four, at the right time. Six, and the right funding. Seven, but it doesn't end there, right? It's dot dot
Yeah.
dot.
Yeah.
It could go more. So I'll let you say a few things about standing out with these
Yeah.
factors.
And the reality is that we never have everything right. Right. That's the reality. I mean, when you read books about entrepreneurship, you are given norms. You must have the right product at the right time for the right people. Blah 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 blah. But when we start, we don't know. Simply don't know. And the reason why I make fun of this kind of normative perception of entrepreneurship is that I want my reader to be prepared to uncertainty. We must have the good intention. We must know that we want to have this kind of target, this kind of features, this kind of. But is it going to work? Not necessarily. Are you ready to readjust the product based on what you see on the ground? Are you ready to have a pre-mortem for each iteration of your product?
Mhm.
Because if you believe that you have it right from the beginning, you're likely to fail very, very quickly.
Mhm.
So I praise myself when I describe the innovation. We want to do the right thing, but we have to go through so many iterations that we have to always readjust what is actually right.
Mhm.
And sometimes when we are readjust, we find out that there is, well, we don't really have a market for that. Okay. And think of the example I take in the beginning of the book is the failure of Einstein, who was a genius. Okay. As Einstein and Siller, who both were geniuses, both knew the industry, both were very talented, very pragmatic. They couldn't make their refrigerator.
Mhm.
That's simple. But they had everything right. So they ended up being Jews um, in a Nazi Germany and fled, had to flee, etc. But everything they wanted to do was right, except that they failed.
Mhm.
And they readjusted actually all the time. It still didn't work. Um, so standing out is very difficult, even when we are remarkable. It depends on so many parameters outside there. I mean, out there. Okay,
Mhm.
that no matter, even if we are remarkable, you may not make it.
Yeah.
The palm was a great product. It disappeared, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, while trying to stand out, a lot of people would fall into the trap of trying to be disruptive,
Yes,
which in your book you mentioned that that's not necessarily something that we want. Why be disruptive when you can be seductive,
yes,
right?
yes. I mean, there has a whole chapter. Well, um, I'm always afraid when entrepreneurs come to me and say, "Well, but my idea is very disruptive." Okay, because this is here again an illusion of grandeur. What are you going to disrupt? Do you think that the world is expecting you to change the whole planet? Come on. Okay. Is there an opportunity for your product to have a smaller focus and make it succeed? So it's this vocabulary about disruption that started with Christensen is a good marketing ploy, probably, but it's not really good for entrepreneurs. It's not a methodology. We don't create stuff to destroy others. We create stuff to create more value. You don't buy an Apple Watch because it's going to destroy the Swiss watch market. It's because you want to have different features. So this whole in the chapter about disruption, I explain the origin of this verbiage, big marketing verbiage, and I think it's totally anachronistic, actually. Um, but it is part of the jargon, and I don't recommend entrepreneurs to say, "Well, I'm going to be disruptive."
Mhm.
Just create something that people want to buy
Yeah, I found it so interesting
and
when you were
seductive.
pushing back against the disruption. It reminded me a long time ago, I started a second master's at Boston University on innovation and entrepreneurship. Uh, and then the class that I was taking had that Clayton Christensen's Disruptive Innovation book as the main book for the course. So we just kept studying. So I remember all of that, and then reading your chapter made me think, and I'm like, I mean, she's right.
I'm glad. I'm glad. I explained the history of the concept of disruption. And so basically, when something becomes trendy, even when, uh, let me go backtrack, even when we speak of innovation, you can have old verbiage to speak of innovation. And for me, disruption is the old verbiage related to innovation.
Mhm.
And
I like
it's,
seduction more.
yeah, yes, I
Seduction
mean,
as the
you want to
innovation.
seduce, not to disrupt. If
Right.
you tell your customer, my product is going to disrupt the world, come on, they are afraid. Okay, they are going to to have other people try the
Yeah.
product.
Sounds like some people are going to lose their jobs as a part of this disruption.
Yeah, they'll lose their job or lose their compass, or they're taking a risk. And so, if you tell people that to take a risk, I mean, usually you want to give security to people. Okay, it's more positive.
Mhm.
But I have not seen, I mean, it took me a while to work on this chapter, have not seen examples of the verbiage of disruption was really valuable, actually.
Mhm.
Among the people that were mentioned as being disruptive was Kodak. And Kodak was not disrupting anything. It was a big mess of all sort of trial and errors in photography. Okay, um, the disruption language is like large companies that rely on their cash cow and don't want to change. Okay, this applies to those old companies, and you have a consultant tell them, disrupt yourself and find do new stuff. Okay,
Mhm.
but apart from this, I just don't see the point of this vocabulary. It's not creativity. It's not a methodology to become creative. That's really, and I explained why it can be double-sworded for entrepreneurs. Definitely.
Mhm. Methodology to become creative. So now you're speaking my language. Let's talk about one thing I saw in your book that made me think. Something I'm personally working on myself. So this is the area, like you say, great innovators are extremely detail oriented and prone to micromanagement. So
Yes.
micromanagement. We see this on in Tony Fadell's book Build. He talks about micromanagement not being a bad thing, but at the same time, I I've been reading books on deep work. Cal Newport has this deep work, deep thinking. He talks about deep work versus shallow work. So, meaning you kind of try to remove stuff, shallow work from your plate as much as possible to leave white space for deeper thinking. So, it almost like I struggled. Today I struggled. I see something is being done wrong. I could step in, right, and maybe micromanage, But in the case of, for instance, Steve Jobs, he doesn't think of it as micromanagement, right? Tony Fadell says he
Yes.
thinks of it as being extremely detail oriented. Like with the stories that we all hear, hey, this nobody's gonna see inside the box, but I know, you know, all those types of stories. How do we reconcile being innovative, being creative, having this white space so that I don't sit in front of my computer always trying to attend to every single task, being detail oriented, versus trying to kind of step away and think about some interesting, innovative ideas. I struggle with this.
Well, you have to do both at the same time. That's as simple as this. It's not obvious, but if you don't get into the details, you're not going to know what's wrong. And usually, what's wrong is a detail. So you can have the best idea of the planet, but if the screw that you put on whatever, right, is not the right size, your whole table is not going to stand on its feet. So it's very critical to be both, to have a vision of bigger landscape and realize that the details are not to be left to just anybody else. Because most of the time, people think, well, okay, my underlings are going to take care of this. But they don't. If they don't, if you don't walk around the floor, excuse me, you're not going to know what's wrong. And for me, it's attention to details. It's what was the big characteristic of Steve Jobs, big characteristic of Bill Gates. Okay, um, and all the bad rap about micromanagement is actually good for people who are not innovative. Okay. Because you have the kind of a CEO who think he's a super financier and so forth, and don't care about products, don't care about what actually we sell. So they don't want to be bothered with details. But sorry, details makes or break a company.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You emphasize the importance of thinking thick. What is
Yes,
thinking thick? How
yeah.
can how can this be helpful to founders?
I'm really glad you noticed this very key concept that unusual. You're an
It's
amazing.
that's why I wanted to talk to you, because
Uh,
this is a very relevant book for my
uh,
work.
okay, thinking thick is understanding that the world around us is complex. And this is a fantastic, this comes from a fantastic book, okay, from Tracy Cotton. And it's never, I mean, the concept was applied in sociology, I think, in the 60s or 70s. But people think, always think again, think better. Thinking thick is thinking of all the implication. When we do something, we think of all the consequences, all the causal system around what we do. And when we think, we want to simplify. I think a big part of creativity is to first make things complex and then clean it up. It's thinking thick and realize that the world around us is never as simple as we would like it to be.
Mhm. Well, Glenn, I have a few more questions. Kind of going back to the
Did I
across.
give you an okay response with that?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
thank you. I kind of also wanted to maybe tie it into deconstruct, make it complex, and then deconstructing is another. But I want to talk about another thing, the multidisciplinary brain concept. So this is related to this bringing things across things, right? So
Yes.
to connect the dots, identify opportunities, uh, super important, easy to say, but what are some of the exercises or habits that we as founders can adapt to cultivate a multidisciplinary brain? Uh, any thoughts on
For
that?
me, the first thing is read a lot and read a lot of things which are not in your space. so that you remain cultivated. Because most of the time, founders are so focused on their job that they forget about the rest of the world. Um, Go to exhibitions because you have the perception of the world by all sorts of very different people. Um, and listen to music because it's just places your brain in a different spot. So for me, literature and the arts, all the liberal arts, are just what actually helps the imagination, and kind of putting oil in the mechanism of the minds. That's really, and sometimes sport, but I'm not so sure about sport because sport helps, especially sports helps with endurance, planning. But when we practice the sport itself, we escape. So when we practice art, we kind of get into ourself, other dimension of ourself, other dimension of the outside world. That's what
Yeah.
I.
I mean, we're speaking the same language. I have to show you this now since you mentioned it.
Yes.
So I started this book,
Uh huh.
and every day I read 1 or 2 pages. I learned about pigments yesterday. Today I'm learning about brush strokes. The other day I learned about perspective. And this was inspired by Scott Belsky. So
Yes.
he,
Uh-huh.
he wrote something, and he says people with taste will kind of own the future. Where in the age of AI, how do you develop taste? Right? Study art. Study the greats. So I just realized, as an engineer, just working on tech startups, tech, code, tech, I mean, listen to music, sure, but I realized I don't know anything history of art at all. So this is one thing that I recently introduced to my life. So it was very nice to hear you mention it. You said go to exhibitions. This is another idea that I embraced from Julia Cameron, the concept of art date. So we do family art dates. So this weekend we have family art date tomorrow, to
Okay.
go to museum,
No,
just to
I
kind
think
of
this
open
is,
up the idea, open
yeah,
up the mind.
exactly. It's you build, you expand your mental landscape.
Yeah. So 2 more questions. I I know we're I know you're not feeling so good, so I don't want to keep you too long. So I'm skipping
But
some
by
of
the way,
them.
it's only a podcast, right? It's not
Yeah.
visual, right?
I mean, if you want, we can cut the video part of it. It can be
But
either
do I
or.
look okay? No.
You look great.
Oh, come on. Okay.
I'll send it to you if you don't like
Okay.
it. So many startups feel the pressure to rush innovations to the market, but you advise them to pace themselves. You did mention sometimes the first mover isn't always the winner. So what do you recommend? How can people strike the right balance between moving quickly and taking the time to get things right?
There's no right balance. Okay. You want me to give you a recipe? Well, I think there is no recipe. Okay. If you go too early, you're going to have customers pissed off because the product is not going to be good. So if you don't have a real team to support you, you know, people are going to be disgusted by your product. So you have to, if you want to persuade people, you have to have the means to persuade them to buy, right? Okay. And when people are disappointed, it's just like in love. They are disappointing for sometimes for a long time, unless unless you are there to help them. And so, if you want to rush your product to the market, um, have fantastic supports people, and then true people who had problem with you will appreciate that you are there to support them. But if you don't, be a little careful.
So another interesting concept is giving up, quitting. Annie Duke wrote a whole book about it. Quit, right? So as entrepreneurs, I mean, not just quitting on a company, but quitting on certain ideas that you
Uh-huh.
pursue in the company, right? Sometimes, I mean, this is right something that happens before a pivot. People talk about, oh, persistence is how you like persist. You must persist as an entrepreneur, but until such time where persistence is a fool's errand at some point, where it would have been better to change directions, how can founders find the right time? Not too early, not too late.
I don't think there is. I think there is no recipe there either. It's um, it's because they could see that their product, their game was not working. That people change tack and basically pivot. The pivoting is, what should I say? It's when things don't work, you can't indefinitely try, right? And you have to look at what you have done and think of how what you have done could be used in a different fashion for a different purpose. So you have to have the flexibility to repurpose something. This is this can happen now and then, and it requires a lot of intellectual honesty and basically as much creativity as what you had in the first place.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
I don't have a very I can't be very dogmatic with that. But some products are the result of kind of meanders, iterations, and end up being something different. I don't think Eastman thought that he would democratize photography the way he did. When he started, he wanted to do better dry plate, and he ended up changing photography. He changed tack several times, pivoted several times.
Yeah. Marlene, I have one final question. It's not about the book, but startup founders, product builders, brand builders. This book goes deep. It's not a shallow entrepreneurship book. It's a true, deep, detailed, realistic innovation book. So, Marlene, final question: what are some of the current projects that you're involved in that excite you this year?
I didn't hear the question.
Oh, some of the current projects that you're involved in that excite you this year.
I'm building a group of CEOs actually in Silicon Valley. Um, Everything is exciting me. I mean, when I see a new product, I'm excited. The project I'm doing is building a group of CEOs, a private advisor group of CEOs, so that it's a sort of boot camp where people analyze their problems, what you described in the beginning of this conversation, and do it in a systematic fashion. So that's what I'm excited about. But as a rule, I'm excited by everything I see and continue to be.
Thank you so much, Maglan, for joining me on the show.
Thank you so much for having me and reaching out for me.